you by the Network for Community Engaged Primary Care Research, NCPCR. This program is presented to you by the CASE NCPCR Methods Core Learning Series. We'll shorten Methods Core to MC. We're so glad that you could join us today because the goals of this MC Learning Series are really to develop and implement in-person and e-learning experiences, support cross-collaboration and shared learning across the NCPCR, MSM, and OCHIN teams within the SEAL Alliance. We also want to inform and educate our audiences, covering topics including recruitment, human subjects, ethics guidelines, data collection procedures, data sharing, and data access and analysis. We'd like you to meet our team. Our director and PI of the CASE project is Dr. Dominic Mack. Also, Dr. Ann Gagliotti, who will be our presenter today, is the co-PI. Our director for the project is Danita Walston, and associate professor here at Morehouse School of Medicine, Megan Douglas. We have our methodology core lead, Peter Baltras. I am Phoebe Nelms. I am the cross-network manager for the project. Heyman Anderson is our communications specialist. Bryant Bailey is our research assistant, and Rhonda Harris is our program manager. A few housekeeping rules as we move into our presentation. The next slide. If you're not speaking, would you be so kind as to please mute your line so as not to disrupt our speaker? We want you to interact with each other and ask questions, and please feel free to do so in the chat. If you can, put your camera on. That would be great for our interaction. And we have a survey at the end that we would love to have your participation in. Now, to introduce our speaker, Dr. Ann Gagliotti. Dr. Gagliotti is a family physician and an associate professor at the Population Health Research Institute at the Metro Health System and Case Western Reserve University, and the Center for Community Health Integration at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. She is a senior strategic advisor and associate professor at the National Center for Primary Care at Morehouse School of Medicine here in Atlanta, Georgia. Her academic career as a teacher and researcher has been focused on advancing equity, patient and community engaged research infrastructure, and measurement of the impact the primary care system has on health and health equity. Dr. Gagliotti serves as the co-director of the Southeast Regional Clinicians Network, or SERCN, a practice-based research network of federally qualified health centers across 8 states. So as we move into our presentation, her passion and enthusiasm for practice-based research will become very evident, and it is a joy to witness her zeal for this topic over the years. So, Dr. Gagliotti, please take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Phoebe, for that kind introduction. And I am so excited to talk with you today and to kick off the NCPCR at CASE Methodology Core learning series. I'm going to be speaking today about practice-based research around why ground-up clinical research is needed. These are the objectives for this talk. I'm hopeful you'll come away understanding the history and values of practice-based research networks, understand how patients and other partners can contribute to improving the health of their communities via research engagement, and learn about the history of patient engagement in the US. I'll sort of start the talk around laying the groundwork of the history and purpose of practice-based research networks, and then we'll move into a discussion of patient engagement and partner engagement and research. And then we'll talk a little bit about how the SEAL NCPCR applies these principles in its approach. So beginning with the history and purpose of practice-based research. When we think about the spaces and participants in traditional biomedical research, we often think of the tertiary academic health center as the place where most of this research occurs. And the people who live near those centers or who are seen at those centers tend to get to participate. Well, when research and evidence is generated out of particular spaces with particular participants, we know that that research is better designed to benefit those sort of select populations. And we certainly all understand the history and behind what has gone wrong in the past in some traditional biomedical research spaces that has led to decreased trust among populations disproportionately impacted by health inequities. So what is a practice-based research network, or what is practice-based research? Practice-based research is sort of the answer to broadening exposure and the spaces and participants in research. The AHRQ defines this, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality defines this as a group of clinicians devoted to the care of patients principally, who are committed to studying and improving care delivery. They affiliate with each other and often academic organizations to investigate the phenomena of clinical practice. Participation by clinicians or practices is voluntary. And often networks will come to their practices with options around participation. There are 5 primary components, including clinicians or practices, investigators, a board, a director, and a coordinator. And the structure of a PBRN is not focused around simply a single study or a single research question. This structure is project agnostic, and so it transcends a single study and usually has a core set of values around research priorities that are based on the needs of the community and the priorities of the community. So what do PBRNs do? PBRNs are built on a foundation of engagement, and they engage clinicians and patients on the front lines of care to develop and frame research questions, to gather data, to interpret findings, and to implement findings. The work that's done in PBRNs produces findings that are easily generalizable and transportable into practice because they were generated from practice. And they're aligned with the values of the people who will be implementing them. So how is this different than other ways of conducting research? PBRN research is located in the community. It is conducted often in primary care settings, although there's a myriad of PBRNs across the country now. We famously have a PBRN of massage therapists here in Northeast Ohio, where I live, that ask and answer research questions. And this research is informed by local experiences and practice and is community engaged around research questions, research priorities, and approaches to implementing research. So when we think about how that differs from a traditional biomedical research space, While in biomedical or traditional biomedical research, diseases are often studied in highly selected patients. Um, and there is often a specific focus on a single disease or disease process. And although things are evolving in this area, this type of research often will not involve the psychosocial context of people's lives. On the other hand, PBRN research, the studies are conducted where most healthcare is delivered in primary care. Comorbidities are common and included because the patients we see in primary care often have multiple chronic conditions. And psychosocial factors are often the focus of study and included. Certainly, PBRNs can also participate in traditional biomedical research, but these are some general differences that I wanted to highlight. So why is practice-based research needed? This is a famous figure from Green's update of even older New England Journal of Medicine article from the 1960s that shows the ecology of medical care. And so this figure represents the care-seeking behavior of 1,000 people in an average month. And you can see out of 1,000 people, about 800 have or report some symptoms, about 327 think about seeking care, and about 217 of them visit a physician's office, with most of those visiting a primary care physician's office. We can see that as we kind of go down those boxes, we have a minority of people who are hospitalized, and then even a smaller subgroup of people who are hospitalized in an academic medical center. And this is where most research occurs. And so this first arrow, then the bigger box, is where PBRN research occurs. And then, this small box is where most traditional biomedical research occurs. So thinking about if you were trying to improve the health of populations and people, where would you conduct research? And I think the founders of the practice-based research movement recognized that to improve population health and translate research into practice, it was going to be helpful to be working in one of those larger boxes to reach the populations that needed to benefit from the work. So I wanted to shift now to speak a little bit about the history and benefits and models of patient and community engagement and research. As I said, engagement is really foundational to the work that practice-based research does, practice-based research networks do. So I just wanted to acknowledge sort of the roots of patient engagement in research and in PBRNs were born out of the community-oriented primary care model. And this is a definition, a quotation from Dr. Mullen, who published this in the American Journal of Public Health in 2002. Community-oriented primary care is a continuous process by which primary health care is provided to a defined community on the basis of its assessed health needs and by the planned integration of public health with primary care. And you can see here a picture of Sydney and Emily Kark, who were working at the Foela Health Center in South Africa, who coined the term and coined this model, community-oriented primary health care. Now we call it community-oriented primary care. And this is sort of the basis of the model. You can see community engagement is at the center of this model. And this model looks very much like a PDSA cycle that we use in quality improvement. So when we talk about patient engagement in research or community engagement or partner engagement in research, we are talking about research that incorporates community input in any phase of the research process. The extent of this input can range from helping researchers define and clarify their research question to much more involved collaboration in defining the research question, implementing the project, analyzing the results, and sharing the findings. And so we see this sort of spectrum and continuum of engagement in research. And so this is just a figure that shows that that spectrum of engagement, with the less intensive engagement occurring on the bottom here, where maybe community members or partners are assisting in discrete steps of a research design study, such as recruitment, to this more intensive part of the scale, where patients or community members are collaborating fully in aspects of research, including defining questions, writing the proposal, implementing the project, and analyzing the results and disseminating the findings. It's important when we talk about patient and community engagement in research that there's a bidirectional exchange of value. And so I think it's important to define the benefits of patient engagement and research for patients and communities. I think one of the benefits is that the work that gets done is prioritized to align with actual needs and meet actual needs of the community. Certainly there's value in partnering with communities in uncovering meaning, with sort of having multiple types of knowledge at the table to interpret findings that may not be interpretable by a research team who does not have shared lived experience with those findings. And it also helps us to translate findings into practice to benefit the populations that can benefit from those changes the most. I just wanted to discuss a few models of patient engagement and community engagement in research and implementation. I think it's important to remember that engagement is a science and is grounded in theory, and should be measured and evolved as a science. And so I really love this framework that came out of the National Academy of Medicine last year. It is a framework to assess meaningful community engagement in health and healthcare programs and policies. And this conceptual model, one thing I love about it is that sort of large blue circle represents the context of the community. And so it acknowledges the drivers of health, the drivers of change in health and healthcare, and the social, political, racial, economic, historical, and environmental context in which we are working. At the center in the green circle, you'll see some core principles around engagement that really are values, principles lived that should be lived in engagement activities. And so trust is a core principle, the bidirectionality of the relationship, inclusivity, cultural centeredness, equitably financed, multi-knowledge, shared governance, ongoing or longitudinal, co-created, and co-equal. So those are the core principles. And then we see in the petals the outcomes by which we can measure community engagement. So has the engagement strengthened partnerships and alliances through mutual value, shared power, structural supports for community engagement? Has it advanced knowledge as far as bidirectional learning and community-ready information? Has it improved healthcare and health policy? Have community-aligned solutions been implemented? Are these sustainable solutions? And then has this work supported thriving communities as far as mental, physical well-being, quality of life, community resiliency, and community power? I think anyone attempting to do community engaged research or practice-based research could really benefit from looking at their work through the lens of this framework. The Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute has also done a lot of work around the science of engagement and research, and they identify key engagement principles very similar to the NAM framework. They speak to reciprocal relationships, true partnership, co-learning, and again, that foundation of transparency, honesty, trust, and I would say trustworthiness on the part of the research team, the non-community research team. This is just an example of, a potential way to apply that rubric into action in a research study. So in the planning phase of the study, are we engaging with patients and community members to develop research questions and identify relevant outcomes? Have we understood who should be the participants in this study? Has some design consideration been undertaken with the community to minimize the disruption to patient and stakeholder participants? And then in the conduct of the study, has there been co-creation around drafting or revising study materials and protocols? Has there been an evaluation of the engagement by those who are being engaged? Are patients or community representatives represented on a data safety monitoring board? And then in the dissemination phase, have those we are engaging with identified partner organizations for dissemination? Are they being included as co-authors or co-presenters on manuscripts and presentations? And has there been an opportunity to present or share information about the study? So some practical frameworks that can be used to evaluate how well we're doing with engagement in a practice-based research network or in other types of research. I do want to now shift to just talk about how the CASE and CPCR is implementing these principles in our work. Just to do some level setting about the NCPCR, this is the Network for Community Engaged Primary Care Research that has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, Morehouse School of Medicine, and OCHIN, a technology innovation company, nonprofit, in Oregon that has a national network of health centers, are both make up the network and are both leading individual projects for the network. This is part of the NIH-led Community Engaged Alliance Against COVID-19 Disparities, or the SEAL initiative, which is a network of state-level programs directed at engaging communities to mitigate COVID-19 disparities. This is a large project that's been funded over 4 years, and 25% of the funding is directly dedicated to community-based primary care organizations. The main goals of the SEAL Alliance are to promote and facilitate inclusion of underrepresented populations disproportionately affected by the pandemic in clinical research. And for the NCPCR, our goal is to invest in community-based primary care practices to build capacity for better inclusion and representation in research. So the mission is to support the SEAL mission by leveraging community-engaged research in primary care settings to address health inequities. The NCPCR recognizes that the trusted voices of healthcare providers are enabled as they engage patients within their communities. In this role, primary care providers actively address misinformation and disinformation related to prevention and treatment of COVID-19 and its lingering effects and symptoms. And so you can see that many of the values of both engagement and practice-based research are embedded in this project. Certainly, there is alignment around empowering community members with awareness and understanding mistrust. And then there's also a focus on equity by promotion of inclusion of populations disproportionately impacted by COVID. So tying these sort of projects together about how does the NCPCR relate to the values of PBRNs, I think there is a recognition of the expertise and effectiveness of frontline primary care safety net clinics to leverage trust, relationships, and clinical quality to advance equity. I think this was particularly apparent to the funders when health centers had a huge equity impact with the work they were doing to vaccinate, test, and care for people with COVID-19. The NCPCR, I think, also recognizes that engagement is foundational to this type of work, and that leveraging long-term partnerships is needed. Excuse me. There's also an aspect of coalition and network building that is integral to this approach that supports and is in alignment with the values of practice-based research networks. I want to talk a little bit now about how we have aligned the engagement structure of the CASE NCPCR project. This slide represents work that was done prior to the time we wrote the proposal for this project. And so this work was based on a PCORI Engagement Award supplement that was focused on understanding what the research priorities were of frontline community health centers in the 8 states that CERSN represents. And so we did a series of listening sessions and interviews to identify priorities that health centers had around engaging in COVID-19 research. And there were many priorities, but these are the 3 priorities that really drove and helped us craft our response and proposal for this opportunity. Our practices said that it was important to leverage health centers as trusted community partners to advance health equity. They said it was important to understand the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on health inequities in population health and chronic disease outcomes. And they wanted us to document solutions that emerged due to the pandemic through partnerships between primary care and public health, including collaborations with national, state, and local health departments and agencies. So they wanted us to understand sort of what solutions emerged during the time of this time of rapid implementation for primary care practices. This is a slide that talks about the overall structure of our project and how our two advisory boards engage with the project. So we have a case advisory board specific to this project, and that's made up of several different representatives. We do have a patient representative. We have a representative from our Primary Care Association quality leadership, and primary care associations are state organizations that act as training, technical assistance, and advocacy groups for health centers in their state. We also have implementation science experts, communications experts, practicing primary care clinicians, and also a member from the OCHAN Advisory Board on our board. And then our Surcent Patient and Partner Advisory Board is made up of patients from health centers across the Southeast who serve as board members for federally qualified health centers. Federally qualified health centers are required to have a patient majority board of directors. And so these are leaders in their health centers, but also consumers, patients who are seen at the health center. And then our partner advisory board is made up of FQHC leaders and primary care association leaders from across the region. And so these are folks who are engaged in frontline care delivery work and quality improvement in health centers. So these two advisory boards work together. As I said, the Surcent Advisory Board ideated the initial priorities that guided this application. They also collaborate with the Case Advisory Board to provide patient, health center, and clinician perspective to inform the project activities. They also reviewed and prioritized material selection and tailoring of materials for our dissemination project that I'm going to talk about in a moment. Our group shares key findings with these advisors to gather feedback and recommendations for analysis, implementation, and dissemination, both through quarterly meetings that occur virtually and then asynchronously using surveys and other outreach tools. Our Case Advisory Board also coordinates around analysis and data collection standards, and will guide the development of a randomized control trial intervention based on formative research and that has been done that I will talk a little bit about in a moment here as well. The Case Advisory Board also informs seal dissemination, material selection, and provides feedback on materials, and provides guidance to the administrative and methods core more generally for the project. So there's a robust engagement infrastructure across both the administrative and methodology cores for the project. But there's also some interesting engagement activities that I wanted to highlight across the specific projects that are being done in the Case NCPCR. So our first project is focused on building a SEAL NCPCR dissemination coalition. And so we are working to build a robust regional and national dissemination network to strengthen the reach of SEAL into primary care practices. And this involves selecting, tailoring, and disseminating evidence-based material generated by the SEAL network to the coalition of regional and national partners that we have built. So these are, we had an engagement process that asked our advisors to prioritize the topics that SEAL has addressed for us. And so the SEAL Alliance has developed a lot of material, and we wanted to be sure that we were tailoring and disseminating materials that were prioritized by our advisors. And so these were their top identified priority topics. And then we wanted to know also who they thought the best audience would be for these topics. And so we further engaged with them to understand who should receive these materials, who should the audience be that these materials are tailored for, and then what types of products would be best for each of these types of disseminations. Based on that information, we worked with our partners at Alliant Health Solutions to develop some draft materials based on that initial feedback. We were then able, at a large meeting, to have some time to review these materials and give specific iterative feedback on how we could make them more appropriate for the audiences they were intended for. And so that information was compiled, shared back with Alliant, and we went through an iterative process to arrive at a final group of dissemination materials for this year. For our second project for the case NCPCR, we're focused on identifying and measuring equity-focused primary care models. And so we wanted to, one, identify the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on existing health inequities. And we're doing that through secondary data analysis. And we also wanted to identify and test innovative COVID-19 care models that were likely to advance health equity nationally and in the Southeast region. To do that, we conducted formative research with PCA and health centers across the region to identify equity-focused care models that were implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we were particularly interested in around models that focused on long COVID, chronic diseases, and preventive care. We also identified in these interviews what were the barriers and facilitators to implementing those care models, and what were the priorities around research and moving forward, and what were the priority areas that they were working on and focusing on as we emerge from the pandemic. The goal is to use these formative research results to design a practice level intervention collaboratively with our advisors, and then to deploy that intervention in a cluster randomized control trial. And so really this is an inquiry and an opportunity to engage with frontline clinicians and understand the implementation experience and harness that innovation from the rapid health center response to COVID to inform an intervention that we are going to test. So we conducted 27 in-depth interviews between the fall of 2022 and spring of 2023 with health center and PCA leaders using a semi-structured guide. Interviews lasted about 45 to 60 minutes and were recorded and transcribed and analyzed by our qualitative analyst team. And then we presented a thematic analysis of these results. We also compiled a clearinghouse of projects that were identified during the interviews So we could provide a little bit more detail about the implementation and detail and goals of the different models of care. We were able to share these results in detail with our case and CERSN advisory boards. And we discussed these results with them, and then had a listening session where we could understand, based on what you're hearing from these results, what are your priorities as far as crafting an intervention? What is it important for us to remember? What are some potential pitfalls? And then, how should we design this intervention as far as some, whether it should be practice level, patient level, clinician level. So we now have that sort of broad feedback from throughout our network around what occurred during the pandemic as far as innovation. We have the synthesis of that. We have the responses from our case and CERSN advisors. And then we also have the ability to kind of iteratively formulate that trial intervention over the next several months. So right now we are finalizing this full formative research report that will be shared with our advisory boards for feedback. We will gather that feedback, share it with our science team to translate those results into a formalized intervention. We'll have an opportunity for feedback and iteration across the advisors and the science team, and then hope to finalize that protocol in fall of 2023. And we think this is really a unique process that we have not seen elsewhere. And so we're sort of in building the bicycle as we ride it here, based on these core principles of PBRN research and patient-engaged research. And so just to conclude, I wanted to summarize here. This project really builds upon the foundation of the practice-based research movement, as well as patient and community engaged research. And I think, applying these principles and processes and core values in research is needed because it makes the work we do relevant to improving people's lives and advancing equity. And we have the opportunity to produce results that are relevant and applicable to primary care settings, and more equitable and translatable, just in the way they were formulated. Building evidence from the ground up with communities is essential to advance equity and improve that lag that we know about from generating evidence to implementation of evidence in practice. Currently, we're looking at about a 17-year lag time, and doing research in this ground up way can improve that lag time and also produce work that is meaningful for the communities where we are working in. I just wanted to open the floor to any questions that people have. I'm happy to answer them. And I just want to thank the Methods Core team for the opportunity to be the first Methods Core Learning Series speaker. It's been great.
Hello, Dr. Gaglioti. We currently do not have any questions in the chat.
We did have one request that the link to this presentation be shared. A colleague was looking out for a fellow colleague and said they need to hear this. And so we were happy to share the link to benefit from this information. We'll just give it another few minutes to see if anyone else? Someone has a raised hand.
Yes, hi. My name's Howard. I thought that was a great presentation. We've got we're calling it a community partnered research network starting where I am. And we have an advisory board, but the advisory board is scheduled to meet every 3 months, which strikes me as perhaps not often enough for really meaningful engagement. Also been struck on our last couple of meetings that the advisory board has been relatively quiet. Behind the scenes, the Academic Medical Center is meeting much more often than that. And by the time we come to the advisory board, I think we're sort of almost asking them to make a couple of minor decisions, but essentially a rubber stamp what we've come up with. And do you have any advice about how to really help assure or try to assure that it's a robust and active and engaged advisory group and not just representatives from different elements of the community? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I think that is a really difficult, that's a common issue. I think that what I have found helpful is having long-term relationships with our patient and partner advisors. And so we know people's strengths, we know the areas that they're working in, we know, and we have that foundational trust that we kind of all know that we're working towards the same goal. So I think there needs to be real effort on the part of the traditional academic researchers to cultivate trustworthiness in that space. The other thing that I think is helpful is to provide, it's very hard to align schedules sometimes for live virtual meetings or in-person meetings. But having opportunities for asynchronous feedback from advisors can also help kind of bridge the gap between those in-person times. And then, conversations or having community members with particular expertise serve on maybe a working group of one of the academic working groups that are meeting more frequently is also a nice way to engage folks. And certainly being sure we're compensating work that's being done asynchronously or on those working groups is important, just like we would compensate a co-investigator on a research project. Those are some of the things. And then I think, acting, having true shared power and, having different types of knowledge be truly valued also sort of perpetuates better engagement, right? So folks hear that their voices are listened to and that their suggestions and priorities are acted upon, and that builds trust and then sort of lays the foundation for continued robust engagement, because people are going to be less apt to share if they feel that they're kind of checking a box, as opposed to if they're sort of an active co-participant, co-creator of the work. So I think those are some things that can be helpful. But I encourage you to read that the paper that accompanies that NAM community engagement model. I think there's a lot of very helpful tips embedded in that framework.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have a comment, thought, or question? We'd love to hear. Okay. That being the case, we want to thank you once again for joining us today for our first in a series of very educational and informative topics, and we hope you'll join us for our upcoming events. Everyone have a fabulous rest of the day, safe and healthy.
Thank you.
I would just encourage everyone to please help us do better next time by completing your evaluation.